My niece fired me on her first day as CEO, ignoring the acquisition deal I had spent 10 years building. She thought she had won. What she didn't realize was that she had just triggered a clause that would cost the family business $500 million. If you want to know why that happened, make sure to like this video. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what the temperature is like there right now. Now, let me tell you the whole story. Starting at 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, a gray, drizzling afternoon where the skyline looked like it had been sketched in charcoal, I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my hand resting on a document thicker than a dictionary and worth infinitely more. Across from me sat Daniel Vane, the lead negotiator for Helios Global, a man who didn't smile so much as subtly rearrange his face when a deal was done. His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than the first car I had ever owned. "The terms are acceptable. Ms. Carter," he said, his voice dry and precise. $6 billion for the acquisition of NovaCrypt Systems, contingent upon regulatory approval and the retention of core leadership during the transition period. Helios Global is pleased to have you. A knot in my chest slowly loosened. 10 years. That's how long it had been since I sketched the first concept of our encryption architecture on a coffee-stained napkin in a roadside diner. Now, it had become the industry standard. "We're proud to join the Helios family," I said, clicking my pen, a silver one I'd carried since college, and signing the final page. To my right sat my older sister, Elena Carter, the company's chairwoman and majority shareholder. Technically, this was her victory, but everyone in that room knew who had built the engine that drove this company. Elena was sweating slightly, her fingers tapping against the table, her eyes avoiding mine. "It's a great day." "Luna," she murmured. "A great day for the family." "It is," I said, closing the leather binder. Mom and Dad would have been proud, for a moment, despite the tension in the room. I allowed myself to believe everything we had built was finally secure. I want to be clear about one thing. This story is fictional, inspired by real workplace situations. Some elements have been enhanced with AI to make it more vivid, emotional, and to highlight deeper lessons. Now, let's continue. The door to the boardroom opened before anyone could reach for the champagne. It wasn't the catering staff. It was my niece. Sophie Carter walked in like she owned the building, her heels striking the hardwood floor with sharp, deliberate clicks that cut through the room's fragile sense of celebration. She had only been with the company for 6 months, fresh out of business school, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. "Are we done here?" she asked, her eyes fixed not on me, but on the signed contract lying in the center of the table. "We just wrapped up," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "We're about to celebrate." "Good," she said, folding her arms, "because we need to talk about restructuring." Immediately, the word hung in the air like a crack in glass. "Restructuring," I repeated. "Sophie, the deal was signed 5 minutes ago. We have a transition plan with Helios. Nothing changes for at least 12 months. She didn't even look at me when she answered. "A lot is going to change." My eyes shifted to my sister. "Elena!" She was already avoiding my gaze. Her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles pale. A quiet dread began to settle in my chest. "Elena," I said slowly, "what is she talking about?" My sister exhaled, as if she had been holding it in for hours. "The board met this morning," she said, "before the signing." A cold silence spread across the table, and I asked. Elena swallowed. "We voted for a leadership transition, effective tomorrow." I felt something inside me go still. "Sophie will be taking over as CEO." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Then Sophie stepped forward, finally meeting my eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It's time for a new vision. Aunt Luna," she said, "you built the foundation. I'll take it from here." The room no longer felt like mine, for a second. No one spoke. The silence was so complete, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft ticking of the wall clock behind me. Then I let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking," I said, looking at Elena. "This isn't how this works. Helios expects continuity. They expect me to lead the integration. Helios expects a Carter to lead," Sophie replied smoothly, stepping closer. "And I am a Carter. A younger one. A sharper one. This company needs to evolve. Aunt Luna, your methods are outdated. I just closed a $6 billion deal," I said, my voice tightening. "I think I understand how to move this company forward." "You closed a deal based on what already exists," she shot back. "I'm here to build what comes next." I turned to Elena again, waiting for her to step in, to stop this before it went too far. She didn't. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Elena," I said, more quietly now. "Say something." It was a board decision. She murmured, "Majority vote." "You are the majority," I replied, disbelief bleeding into anger. "You control this company." Her silence was the answer. That was when I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a power struggle. It was a betrayal. Sophie tilted her head slightly, watching me as if she had already won. "You should start packing your things," she said, her tone almost casual. "HR will contact you in the morning about your exit package." The words landed harder than I expected. 15 years of building, fighting, sacrificing, reduced to a polite dismissal in a room I had once commanded. "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice low and steady, even as something inside me cracked. "A very expensive one." Sophie smiled, completely unbothered. "I think we can afford it." And just like that, I was no longer the person who built the company. I was the person they had decided to erase. If you think Sophie Carter did the right thing by firing me the moment she took power, then comment support the young. But if you believe what she did was reckless and disrespectful, write disrespect, and your voice matters more than you think. The next morning, the sky hung low and heavy, the kind of dull gray that made everything feel slower, colder. I arrived at the office at 7:45 a.m., just like I had every day for the past decade. Routine has a way of grounding you, even when everything else begins to fall apart. I tapped my keycard against the scanner. A sharp red light flashed. I paused, then tried again. Red. A third time. Slower now. Still red. "Ms. Carter?" I turned to see Marcus, the head of security. I had hired him myself years ago. I knew his family, had attended his retirement party for his father. Today, he couldn't even meet my eyes. "There must be a mistake," I said calmly. "My access isn't working." "It's not a mistake." "Ma'am," he replied, his voice low. "I have orders. Your access has been revoked." The words landed with a quiet finality. By whom, I asked, though I already knew the answer. "CEO's directive," he said. "Ms. Sophie Carter?" For a brief second. Something inside me tightened, but I forced it back down. "Fine," I said, straightening my coat. "Then escort me. I'll collect my things." The walk through the lobby felt longer than it ever had. Conversations died as I passed. People stared at their screens, pretending not to notice, in a company this size. News like this didn't travel, it exploded. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, I saw it immediately. My name was gone. In its place, a printed sheet of paper taped to the glass door read Sophie Carter, Chief Executive Officer. I took a slow breath and stepped forward, but Marcus gently moved to block my path. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're not authorized to enter." Instead, the legal director approached, holding a small cardboard box. "This is standard procedure," he mumbled. I looked inside. A photo, a mug, a stress ball. That was all 15 years had been reduced to. The rain finally began to fall as I stepped outside, thin and steady, soaking into the pavement like the end of something that had once felt permanent. I stood there for a moment, the cardboard box in my hands suddenly heavier than it should have been. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Claire, my executive assistant. She's changing the server access codes. She fired 2 senior engineers. She says we're pivoting the entire strategy. I stared at the screen. Of course she was. Sophie wasn't just replacing me. She was rewriting everything. And that's when something clicked. A memory. A conversation from weeks earlier during negotiations. A clause I had insisted on. Something Daniel Vane had pushed for with unusual intensity. I turned toward my car. I needed to get home. The drive passed in a blur of rain and silence. By the time I reached my house, my hands were no longer shaking from anger. They were steady now, focused. I went straight to my office and opened the safe. Inside were the physical copies of every critical agreement. Not files on a server that could be deleted with a keystroke, but paper, permanent. I pulled out the acquisition contract and placed it on my desk, flipping through the pages quickly, my eyes scanning for one specific section. There. Section 4.3, Key Personnel Clause. My finger traced the lines as I read. The continued leadership of Luna Carter is a material condition of the acquisition. The agreement is executed in reliance on her operational control and technical expertise. I leaned closer, reading the next paragraph slowly. In the event that the key individual is terminated, removed, or otherwise separated from her role without written consent from Helios Global, the agreement shall be rendered immediately null and void. I exhaled. The deal was gone. But it didn't stop there. I read the final line again. Just to be sure, a breach of this condition will trigger a compensation penalty of $500 million. I sat back in silence. Sophie hadn't just fired me. She had just signed the company's collapse. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the page as the weight of it settled in. $500 million. Not a projection, not a risk, a certainty. I reached for my phone, already knowing who I needed to call. Amelia Scott. The last time I had spoken to her was years ago, during a patent dispute that nearly cost us everything. She hadn't just won that case, she had dismantled the opposition piece by piece. Precise, relentless. She answered on the second ring. "Luna Carter," she said, her voice sharp with recognition. "I was just reading about your big deal. Shouldn't you be celebrating?" I was. I replied quietly. "Until I got fired." There was a pause. "You're serious. Effective immediately." My niece took over. She didn't read the contract. Another pause. "Shorter this time. Which clause?" "Section 4.3, I said. "Key personnel." I could almost hear the shift in her posture on the other end of the line. "Does Helios know? Yet not yet." Her tone changed completely, dropping into something colder, more focused. "Do you want to negotiate?" she asked. "Or do you want to enforce?" I looked down at the contract again, at the words that had just turned everything upside down. I thought about the red light on the scanner, the cardboard box, the silence in the lobby. I don't want a settlement. I said, "I want the contract executed exactly as written." "Good." Amelia replied without hesitation. "Then we move fast." Within an hour. I was sitting across from her in her office, the contract open between us. She didn't waste time. "We notify Helios directly," she said. "Not your company, not your sister. We go straight to the buyer. They'll terminate the deal immediately." I said, "Yes." She nodded. "And they'll demand the penalty. They have a fiduciary obligation to do so." She slid a document across the table. "A formal notice of breach. All you have to do," she said, placing a pen beside it, "is sign." I picked it up. And without hesitation, I did. "Send it," I said. And just like that, the countdown began. The next 48 hours unfolded in silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that feels like pressure building behind a sealed door. I stayed home. ignoring every call that lit up my phone. Elena called. The board called. Even numbers I didn't recognize kept appearing, one after another. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I waited. At 4:32 p.m. on Thursday, Amelia's message came through. Delivered. That was all it said. I knew exactly what it meant. Somewhere in a glass tower across the city, Helios Global had just opened a letter that would change everything. An hour later, my phone started ringing again. This time, I answered. Luna! Daniel Vane's voice came through, colder than I had ever heard it. I've received a notice of material breach. I need you to confirm something. It's true, I said. I've been removed from my position. There was a brief pause, followed by the faint sound of typing. I see, he replied. Then the acquisition agreement is void. Effective immediately. I understand. We will be initiating enforcement procedures. He continued. The penalty clause will be executed. $500 million. Payable within 5 business days. You have every right to do so. The line went quiet for a moment before he added, I assume your company is aware of the consequences. They are now. When the call ended, I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. It had begun, within hours. The ripple effect hit. Claire's messages came in rapid succession. Accounts frozen. Banks pulling credit lines. Payroll delayed. Another message. The CFO is in Sophie's office. She's screaming. No one knows what to do. Then another. People are packing their things. Some think we're going under. I stared at the screen, reading each line carefully. 10 years of work. Hundreds of employees. All unraveling in real time. Not because of the market. Not because of competition. But because someone had been too arrogant to read a contract. And now, the company was paying the price. By Friday morning, the collapse was no longer contained inside conference rooms and whispered conversations. It was everywhere. The financial press picked it up first. Nova Crypt deal collapses. CEO shakeup triggers $500 million penalty. The headline spread fast, faster than any internal memo ever could. What had been confusion turned into panic almost instantly. Claire kept sending updates. The banks have frozen everything. Credit lines are gone. Another message followed minutes later. Payroll didn't go through this morning. People are asking questions. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the floor I used to walk every day, engineers staring at their screens, managers refreshing their inboxes, waiting for answers that would never come. Then my phone rang. Elena. This time, I answered. Luna. Her voice broke before she could steady it. We need to fix this. You already made your decision. I replied calmly. We didn't know, she said quickly. Sophie didn't read the clause. We thought we could transition leadership without consequences. There are always consequences. I said. There was a long pause. We can bring you back, Elena continued, desperation creeping into her tone. You can take your role again. We'll reverse everything. Just call Helios and tell them it was a misunderstanding. I let out a slow breath. I can't lie to a public corporation to save you, I said. That's not how this works. Then we're finished, she whispered. You were finished the moment you let her sign that decision. The line went silent. By the afternoon, Claire's updates turned darker. Legal is preparing for bankruptcy. The CFO says we don't have the liquidity. Not even close. Another message followed. They're talking about Chapter 7. I stared at the words. Liquidation. Everything sold. Everything gone. A few hours later, another call came through. Not Elena this time. The company's legal director. We're filing, he said quietly. There's no other option. And just like that, what had taken years to build collapsed in less than a week, not with a single moment, but with a series of decisions that could never be undone. 3 weeks later, I walked back into the building I once ran, not as an executive, not even as an employee, but as a registered bidder. The lobby felt hollow. The polished floors were still there. The glass walls still reflected the skyline. But everything else had changed. Furniture had tags on them. Desks were numbered. Even the artwork that once lined the walls had been cataloged like inventory. This wasn't a company anymore. It was a liquidation site. I moved through the space slowly, my footsteps echoing in a silence that felt heavier than noise. A few other bidders wandered around, inspecting equipment, opening drawers, checking labels. To them, this place wasn't history, it was opportunity. I reached the executive floor. The conference room where I had signed the $6 billion deal now had sheets of paper taped to the walls, listing item numbers and lot codes. The long mahogany table had a sticker on its edge. Everything had a price now, just not the one it once had. I spotted Elena sitting alone in what used to be her office. The large chair behind the desk was gone, replaced by a simple folding one. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. "You came," she said quietly. "I did," I replied. "To watch," she asked, her voice bitter. "To assess." I said. She let out a hollow laugh. "It's all worthless now," she muttered. "$6 billion, gone, not worthless." I corrected gently. "Just misunderstood." I left her there and walked toward the R&D lab. That was where the real value had always been. The machines were still there, the prototypes, the servers. But without the system behind them, they were nothing more than metal and wires. To everyone else, not to me. The auction was held the next day in a quiet, windowless room. Rows of chairs filled with buyers who saw pieces, not a whole. When the intellectual property came up, the room grew still. Bidding started low, much lower than it should have been. I raised my hand. For the first time since I had walked out of that building, I wasn't watching anymore. I was taking it back. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Sold. Just like that. It was mine again. The core patents, the architecture, the technology that had once been valued at $6 billion. Now back in my hands for a fraction of that price. I didn't celebrate. I simply signed the papers. Across the room, Elena sat frozen, her expression hollow. Sophie wasn't there. I had heard she hadn't left her apartment in days. Lawsuits were already forming, creditors circling. The empire they thought they controlled had dissolved into debt and consequences. I walked out of that room with something far more valuable than money: control. Within weeks, I launched a new company, Carter Systems. No board politics, no inherited authority, just structure, clarity, and ownership built on experience, not entitlement. Helios reached out again. This time not to acquire, but to partner. On my terms. I stood in my new office one evening, looking out at the city. The same skyline that once felt distant, now sharper than ever. They thought removing me would end everything. They were wrong. It was the beginning. Some moments don't break you. They reveal who you really are. What happened to me wasn't just a loss. It was a reminder that value doesn't come from titles, positions, or family ties. It comes from what you build, what you know, and what no one can take away from you. The first lesson I learned is this: never let anyone underestimate your role, especially when you are the foundation of something great. The second lesson is that decisions made in arrogance always carry a cost, and sooner or later, that cost must be paid. And the third lesson: always protect your work, legally and strategically, because loyalty without safeguards is just vulnerability in disguise. So what about you? What lesson did you take from this? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. If this story meant something to you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes, the right story at the right moment can change everything.
Welcome to Boardroom Revenge Stories, a channel focused on workplace conflict, corporate betrayal, power struggles, and quiet justice. Our stories follow a structured workflow to deliver a consistent, immersive experience. We start by analyzing real discussions on Reddit, Facebook, Quora, and blogs. Next, we craft original scripts using AI tools like ChatGPT. We then use 11 Labs to transform text into high-quality voice and edit everything in CapCut for a smooth, cinematic finish. Thumbnails are designed with Canva, and every video is carefully reviewed before release. These stories go beyond entertainment, revealing how power truly works and how justice quietly unfolds.